In the unforgiving wilds of Dakota Territory, a widow clutching twin babies arrived with nothing but hope and a letter promising a future. But when the man she came for slammed his door, another quietly opened his. A man haunted by loss, a woman fighting for her children, and a town that didn't know how much it needed them both. This isn't just about survival. This is about how love sometimes grows in the most unlikely soil. Snow swirled mercilessly as the coach jolted to a halt on Riverbend's weathered main street. Mabel Quinn pressed her lips against her twin babies' soft heads, whispering through chattering teeth, "Almost there, darlings. Almost somewhere better." The journey had been long. Philadelphia to Chicago, Chicago to Bismarck, and now the final wind-choked ride here. Her boys, Elliot and Jude, barely 6 months old, stirred restlessly against her. Elliot fussed, cheeks red from the chill, while Jude remained nestled in dreamless exhaustion. The stagecoach door creaked open. "End of the line, miss," the driver grunted. "Riverbend." With trembling arms, Mabel adjusted her threadbare shawl and clumsily balanced the twins. Just as she braced herself to step into the biting wind, a hand appeared. "Need help?" The driver, softened by the sight of her burden, eased Elliot from her hold and guided her down. "Thank you kindly," she managed, though her voice barely cut through the cold. Riverbend was modest, almost bleak. A few wooden buildings clung stubbornly to the earth. General store, saloon, livery, and farther up, a church steeple fighting against the gray sky. But it was the general store that mattered. A sign read Pike's Mercantile. Vernon Pike, the man who had promised her a new start. Mabel swallowed hope like bitter medicine as she approached the entrance. Twins secured once more in her arms. She pushed open the heavy door, the bell above jingling faintly. A tall, broad man with sandy hair, streaked silver at the temples, turned. Vernon Pike fit his letters, respectable, proper, maybe even kind. But the moment his eyes dropped to the babies, something shifted. His polite smile froze, fell, and turned cold. "Mabel Quinn?" he asked stiffly. "Yes," she said softly, already feeling the tightening in her chest. "And these are Elliot and Jude, my boys. I wrote." "You never mentioned children." His voice was low but sharp. Mabel blinked. "I did, in my second letter. I wrote that I was widowed and that my sons were part of the bargain. You even sent your sympathies." "I never received such a letter." Vernon's jaw clenched. "I agreed to take in a wife, not someone else's burdens." The store fell unnervingly quiet. Two men by the stove shifted awkwardly, pretending not to listen. Mabel's stomach twisted painfully. "I'm sorry," she said, feeling the heat of humiliation mixed with the freezing air biting through the open door. "But I cannot undo their existence." "Well," Vernon huffed, gesturing vaguely toward the street, "I'm not running a charity. I won't marry a woman with children." Tears threatened to spill, but Mabel forced herself still. "Then, what am I supposed to do?" Vernon hesitated. "There's a boarding house up the street. I'll cover a night or two. After that, you'll need to find your own way." With that, he turned his back, retreating into the shadows of his store, as though she were already gone. Stunned, heart pounding, Mabel stepped back into the snow, clutching the twins tightly. Their cries broke the fragile silence of the street. Her lips trembled. "Mama's here! Mama's here!" But the words felt empty as the cold gnawed at her spirit. That's when she heard the boots. Turning, she found herself face to face with a woman bundled tightly in a heavy wool coat, silver hair peeking beneath her bonnet. Her sharp, clear eyes held none of the judgment Mabel feared, only concern. "Name's Hattie Lovell," the woman said briskly. "I run the boarding house, and unless you plan on freezing out here, you and those babies best come with me." Relief nearly buckled Mabel's knees. I have little money," she confessed, voice cracking. Hattie waved her off. "Your purse can wait. Babies can't." Within moments, Mabel found herself hustled through the snow and into warmth. The boarding house smelled of stew and hearthwood. It hummed with life, with softness. As Hattie's daughter-in-law brought towels to dry the twins, Mabel sank into a rocking chair, exhaustion overtaking shame. But just as she thought she could breathe, the front door opened again. A man stepped inside, tall, weathered, and carrying a black leather medical bag. His hair was dark but dusted with gray at the edges. His eyes, though, were sharp and alive. "Evening, Hattie," he said with a nod, pulling off his gloves. Then his gaze fell on Mabel and the wailing twins. "And who might this be?" "Mabel Quinn," Hattie supplied. "Fresh off the stage. Found herself frozen stiff with no husband in sight. This here's Dr. Silas Everett." Silas approached slowly, his expression unreadable. But when he crouched to examine Elliot, his fingers were gentle, his tone softer than the firelight. "These little fellas have had a hard go, haven't they?" He looked up at Mabel, his voice kind. "You've done well just getting them this far." Mabel met his eyes, something steady and warm passing between them. For the first time that day, she did not feel small. For the first time since she stepped off that stagecoach, someone saw not burden, but bravery. The room Hattie Lovell had given her was small, with faded blue wallpaper and a bed that creaked every time Mabel Quinn moved. But it was warm, and that alone made it feel like a sanctuary. The twins, finally fed and dry, were nestled side by side in the wicker bassinet Hattie had retrieved from her attic. She said it had once cradled her own children years ago. Mabel sat beside it in silence, watching their chests rise and fall with sleep. Every so often, Jude would stretch a tiny fist in the air, or Elliot would make a soft sound that broke her heart in the gentlest way. They were innocent of everything, including how close they'd come to spending the night in the snow. She didn't know how long she sat there before Hattie came in again, holding a steaming cup of something that smelled earthy and comforting. "Chamomile and cinnamon," the older woman said, setting it on the nightstand. "Good for nerves. I imagine yours are in tatters." "They are," Mabel whispered, voice thick. Hattie studied her for a moment, then pulled a chair close. "I've seen women arrive in worse shape," she said, "but not many." Mabel gave a thin smile. "I had no choice. Philadelphia was closing in on us inch by inch. I answered Mr. Pike's advertisement thinking it was a miracle, that he'd understand. Pike understands money, reputation, and his reflection in the mirror," Hattie said. "I've known him since he was a boy stealing candy from the mercantile. Don't let that man's pride make you question your worth." Mabel looked down at her hands. "He offered to pay for 2 nights. I suppose I should thank him." "You suppose wrong," Hattie said bluntly. "You're not a burden here. You're a guest. And if that man cared half as much as he claims to about honor, he'd be here apologizing instead of hiding behind his shop window." They sat in companionable silence until a soft knock interrupted them. Dr. Silas Everett stepped into the room with the same quiet grace as before. He wore a charcoal coat and scarf now, freshly dusted with snow, and carried a small satchel. "I wanted to check the babies," he said. "Travel like that, cold, wet, can cause trouble in little ones fast." Mabel nodded and stepped aside as he approached the bassinet. He examined Jude first, then Elliot, his fingers moving with practiced care. He spoke in a low murmur as he worked, not for her benefit but for the babies, reassuring them maybe, or simply out of habit. "They're strong," he finally said, standing upright. "A little underweight, but not dangerously so. You've done well." Mabel blinked back a rush of tears. No one had said that to her, not since the night she buried her husband and realized she was carrying twins. "Thank you, Doctor." "Silas," he corrected gently. She hesitated. "Mabel." They exchanged nods, a quiet understanding hanging in the air. He adjusted his scarf. "I'll be staying in town tonight. There's a stubborn case of winter croup on the north end. But if you need anything, you send for me. Hattie knows how." "I will," she said, and meant it. After he left, Hattie lingered a moment longer. "He's not what most expect," she said. "Lost his wife and daughter to fever years ago. After that, he stopped smiling altogether. But I've seen the way he looks at people when they're not watching. He still cares, just doesn't show it the usual way." Mabel looked down at her sons. "I can understand that." The next morning, Mabel woke before the sun, her body aching from the journey. She slipped out of bed and dressed in her second-best dress, a simple gray wool, while the boys still slept. She needed to think ahead now. A week, maybe 2. That's all she had before she ran out of the little money Vernon hadn't robbed her of. By the time she came downstairs, Hattie had already set out a pot of coffee and slices of cornbread on the long kitchen table. A few of the other boarders nodded politely, though none offered conversation. She didn't blame them. In a town like this, gossip traveled faster than any stagecoach. She was the woman with twins who got turned away. That would be her name for a while. Halfway through her second cup of coffee, the door opened and in walked Vernon Pike. Mabel froze. He removed his gloves with unnecessary precision, ignoring the way conversation ceased around the table. "Hattie," he said, "I've come to settle the account I promised." "I'm aware," Hattie said flatly, not rising from her chair. "2 nights, wasn't it?" He opened his wallet, pulled out folded bills, and laid them on the sideboard. "That should cover it." Hattie didn't touch the money. "You have something to say, Vernon?" Mabel asked calmly, not rising. His mouth tightened. "Only that I hope you'll find your way without dragging others down in the process." Mabel's voice didn't rise. "My sons are not burdens, and I'm not asking anyone to carry me. Just stay out of my way." Vernon turned to leave but paused at the door. "I did what I could." "No," she said. "You did what was easy." The door slammed behind him. No one spoke for several moments. Finally, Hattie reached for the money, counted it, and placed it in a drawer. "Guess that settles that," she said. Mabel looked down at her coffee, hands no longer trembling. She had no man, no job, and no plan. But she had her sons, and sometimes survival was the loudest answer a woman could give. The days that followed passed with the grim rhythm of survival. Mabel Quinn rose with the sun each morning to care for Elliot and Jude, then helped Hattie with laundry and bread making in exchange for extra nights at the boarding house. The chores were menial, but they kept her mind steady, her body moving, and her boys fed. Each evening, after supper and baths and lullabies sung over the creaky wicker bassinet, Mabel sat by the parlor window, watching the street below. Cedar Bluff was quiet after dark, save for the occasional silhouette of a man returning late from the saloon or the doctor's buggy pulling in from a distant call. That buggy came often. Silas Everett seemed to treat half the town, and the town was lucky for it. Yet it hadn't escaped Mabel's notice that he always stopped by the boarding house when he returned, sometimes to check on a boarder, sometimes to deliver herbs or a tincture to Hattie. But more often than not, he knocked on her door to ask, "And how are the boys tonight?" She started to anticipate the sound of his boots on the steps, the warm rasp of his voice when he entered, the way he looked at her sons as though they mattered in a world that had made them inconvenient. And then came the afternoon when the knock was different, quicker, more deliberate. Hattie opened the front door and found Silas standing there, wind-blown and flushed from the cold. "I need to ask a favor," he said without preamble. Hattie narrowed her eyes. "You're not bleeding, so it must be something unusual." Silas gave a thin smile. "It's about Mabel." Mabel appeared in the hallway, a sleepy Jude on her hip. "About me?" He stepped inside, pulling his gloves off slowly. "I've been thinking. I've needed help at the clinic for over a year. My last assistant moved east to be near family, and I've been managing the books and patient files on my own ever since." "You need a clerk," Mabel said cautiously. "I need someone dependable, organized, who can follow instruction and learn on the job, and someone who won't flinch at the sight of blood or sick children." She raised a brow. "You think that's me?" "I know that's you." Hattie crossed her arms, clearly interested. Silas continued, his tone gentler now. "It's not charity, it's work. I can pay, not much to start, but enough to cover your stay here or elsewhere if you prefer. And if the boys come with you, I've space in the back room. It was once a nursery." Mabel blinked. "You'd allow them at the clinic?" "They're part of the bargain," he said simply. "Just like you said." Her throat tightened. No man had said such words to her since James died. No one had looked at her little family and seen anything but burden. Until now. "I'll think about it," she said carefully, heart pounding. "Good," he said with a small nod. "Think fast. I've got 5 dressing changes and an expectant mother due in a week." He turned to go, then paused. "You'll be good at it. I'll make sure of that." After he left, Hattie leaned in. "You'd be a fool not to take that offer." "I don't know the first thing about medicine." "You know enough about pain," Hattie said. "That's a start." The next morning, Mabel arrived at the small wood-frame clinic just past the church, carrying Elliot and Jude in a quilt-lined basket. She wore her warmest dress and a newly mended shawl, her hair pinned back tight. She wasn't sure what kind of impression she made, but it would be honest. Silas greeted her with that half smile she was learning to interpret: curiosity, warmth, restraint. He showed her around with efficiency: a front room for waiting, a rear room for surgery and births, shelves lined with neatly labeled jars and bottles, a locked cabinet for more dangerous substances. Then he opened a narrow door to a sunlit alcove with a window seat and an old crib pushed into the corner. Dust coated the frame, but Mabel saw the outline of care in the placement, in the way the sunlight caught the carved wood. "It was my daughter's," he said softly. "Grace." Mabel placed the basket down gently. "I won't let them break anything," she whispered. "I know you won't." They worked in silence that first day. Silas tended patients. Mabel copied notes, boiled linens, swept the floors. She kept the twins within reach, soothing them as needed, rocking Jude with one foot while labeling tonic bottles by hand. She misread 2 dosages and dropped a jar of calendula oil, but Silas only corrected her once, then offered to show her a better method. That evening, he walked her and the twins back to the boarding house. "You did well today," he said. "Your handwriting's a menace," she replied deadpan. His laughter was quiet and sudden, almost a surprise to himself. Guilty. When they reached the steps, Mabel turned. "Thank you for not seeing us as trouble." He looked at her then, really looked, and said, "Anyone with sense can see you're the strongest person in this town. Trouble doesn't survive what you've survived." She carried that compliment with her the rest of the night, not on her sleeve, but somewhere deeper, where the warmth stayed. By spring, Mabel Quinn's presence in Cedar Bluff was no longer whispered about behind lace curtains. It was debated openly in parlors and over fence posts. Some said she was a scandal waiting to happen. Others, mostly women with children or sick husbands, said they trusted her more than any man in town. The work at Silas Everett's clinic had become part of her, and so had the rhythm of the place. Morning rounds with ledger and pen in hand, washing and folding bandages while Silas saw to patients. An afternoon spent learning more than she'd ever imagined she could. Boils and burns, childbirth and fevers, how to make tinctures and when to hold a hand, and always with Elliot and Jude nearby, giggling on the clinic floor, pulling themselves up on chairs, becoming fixtures as familiar as the medicine shelves. By now, Mabel could almost forget how it had all started. Almost. It was the town that refused to forget. The whispers came first. Old Mrs. Harper, who still clung to ideas of proper women, muttering in church. Then came the sidelong glances when Mabel accompanied Silas on house visits to women in labor. Always women, always necessary. And finally the visit from the Ladies' Aid Committee. It was a dreary Wednesday afternoon when Hattie arrived at the clinic, cheeks flushed with indignation. "There's stirring trouble," she announced without preamble. "Olivia Harper and her circle, talking about how unseemly it is for a young widow to live under a man's roof." Mabel looked up from the ledger. "But I don't. Not truly. I work here, and we sleep in the attached house because of the twins." "I know that," Hattie said, cutting her off. "The sensible folk know that. But when has sense ever mattered to gossip?" Before Mabel could answer, the front door swung open. Silas strode in, snow still melting on his shoulders from a morning visit to the Pearson farm. He took one look at the tension in the room and set his bag down slowly. "What now?" Hattie gave him the abbreviated version. Silas listened, arms folded, his jaw tightening with each word. "This is absurd," he said when she finished. "This arrangement benefits the town. You've improved this clinic's records, organized medicines, and cared for patients in ways no man could match. Half these women wouldn't come through the door without Mabel greeting them first." "I don't need convincing," Hattie replied, "but the Ladies' Aid is preparing a petition for the town council." Mabel felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Not again. Not after building so much here. Silas's eyes found hers. "This isn't about propriety," he said firmly. "This is about power, about certain families in town disliking change and using any excuse they can to try and push back." What happens if they succeed? Mabel asked quietly. They won't, Silas said with certainty. But if they did, they'd make it hard for me to keep the clinic open within town limits, or for you to work here at all. Mabel swallowed. There it was again, the weight of survival falling squarely onto her shoulders and threatening to crush her. I won't bring trouble to your door, she said after a long pause. If it comes to it, I'll find somewhere else. Hattie's offered her attic for the summer. The twins and I can manage there. And no, Silas's voice stopped her cold. He stepped closer, his expression so intense it left no room for doubt. You belong here. You belong right here, in this clinic, in this role. And I won't let narrow minds decide otherwise. For a long moment, no one spoke. Mabel searched his face, trying to read past the frustration to something deeper. She found it. Not anger at the town, but protectiveness. Not obligation, but genuine belief. He didn't just want her here. He respected her here. I won't run, Mabel said softly. A small smile tugged at the corners of Silas's mouth. Good, because I need you right where you are. In the days that followed, the tension in town simmered, but never boiled over. Silas and Mabel kept to their routines, though every knock at the door felt a little heavier. Still, life pushed on. Mabel's mornings became filled with duties that stretched far beyond filing. She assisted in examinations, measured medicines, and even calmed a laboring mother through a long and difficult night. Silas guided her through each new experience with quiet patience. You have steady hand, he remarked one evening as they cleaned up after stitching a ranch hand's leg. Most new assistants are nervous around wounds. I've seen enough life to know blood doesn't end it, Mabel replied simply. Silas looked at her for a long beat, something like admiration deepening in his eyes. Later that night, after the clinic was dark and the boys were asleep in the nursery down the hall, Mabel sat in the tiny parlor with Silas. They shared the last of the coffee in companionable silence until he finally broke it. They'll keep pushing, he said quietly. The town, the committees, people like Harper who want to keep their grip on things. I know, Mabel said. Are you ready for that? She thought for a long moment before answering. I didn't cross half a continent and survive rejection, shame, and cold nights just to give up when it gets uncomfortable. Silas leaned back, his expression softening as though some internal weight eased. Good, he said again, with a quiet finality, because neither did I. The flickering lamplight caught the faintest hint of something new between them. Not obligation or gratitude, but quiet recognition, of equals, of survivors, of something that, perhaps, neither dared name yet. The trouble did not fade quietly. Spring's thaw brought more than melting snow. It stirred voices in Riverbend. Voices that gathered behind closed doors and over polished counters in the general store. By the end of May, it was no longer whispers. The town council posted notice of a public hearing. Subject: Dr. Everett's clinic and improper domestic arrangements. The language was measured, but the intent was not. Mabel Quinn read the notice twice before folding it neatly and tucking it into her apron. She had known something like this would come. What she hadn't known was how calm she would feel when it did. The night before the hearing, Mabel sat in the nursery, the twins finally asleep in their crib, moonlight silvering their downy heads. She heard Silas before she saw him, his steady, familiar step in the hallway. He paused in the doorway, jacket undone, sleeves rolled, the weariness of the day softening his usual sternness. They're peaceful, he said quietly, nodding toward Elliot and Jude. For now, Mabel replied. You know how they are. Dawn will turn them into wild things again. He smiled faintly, then his face sobered. I don't want you to be frightened about tomorrow. I'm not, she answered honestly. Good, because I am. She blinked, surprised. Not for myself, he clarified. For what they might say to you. About you. Mabel rose, smoothing her skirts. Silas, I spent nights in rail cars with strangers. I spent my last pennies to buy milk for these boys when my hands shook too badly to lift the cup. I've been judged before, harshly, cruelly, by people who knew far less about me than Riverbend does now. She stepped closer to him, voice steady. They can't shame me more than life already has. and they can't take away what I've built here." Silas studied her face. Whatever he saw there made his jaw relax just slightly. "I wish they could see you like I do," he murmured. Mabel's pulse quickened, but she held his gaze. "Tomorrow, they just might." The hearing was held in the town meeting hall, a squat wooden building that smelled faintly of old ink and coal dust. It seemed like half the town had come. Men in dust-covered work shirts, women with infants on hips, and older townsfolk sitting stiffly in the front row. Mabel entered with Silas, her head high. The twins left safely with Hattie back at the boarding house. The murmur in the hall quieted the moment they stepped through the door. Councilman Edward Walsh, a stocky man with a round face that tried to look impartial, cleared his throat. "Dr. Everett," he began, "and Miss Quinn—" "Mrs. Quinn," Silas corrected immediately, his voice crisp. Mabel's head turned slightly toward him in surprise. He met her look briefly, then faced the council again, standing straighter. "Mrs. Quinn works here, lives here, and carries the weight of this practice beside me. You may continue." There were a few murmurs at the formality of his words, his deliberate emphasis on respect. Walsh shifted uncomfortably. The issue raised by several citizens regards appearances. It is believed that, while medical help is appreciated, it is improper for an unmarried woman to live under the same roof as a man, especially while serving in such a public role. Mabel stepped forward before Silas could respond. "If you'll allow me to speak," she said evenly. Walsh nodded reluctantly. She clasped her hands together, steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "When I came to Riverbend, I had nothing but my sons and a promise written on paper. That promise was broken at the stagecoach station. Since then, I've made no other promises but the ones I've kept with my own two hands." Her voice did not waver. "I work in this clinic. I keep its books. I assist with patients. I learn from Dr. Everett daily. I've been in your homes, tending to your children when they burned with fever. I've held the hands of women in labor when no one else dared to stay. If appearances trouble you, I ask, should I have left those families to suffer just so I might seem more proper?" The room was utterly still. Even Olivia Harper, seated smugly in the second row, folded her arms and said nothing. "I am a widow," Mabel continued quietly. "But more than that, I am a mother, a worker, and a neighbor. The work I do here is honest. The love I give my children is honest. And this arrangement, however unconventional it may seem to some, has only ever been built on respect and shared purpose." She paused, letting her words settle. "If any here wish to accuse me of dishonor, say so plainly. But if not," she looked each council member squarely in the eye, "then let me continue to serve as I have. Not because I owe this town, but because I belong to it now as much as any of you." When she finished, there was a moment of heavy silence. Then a voice broke through the tension. "My wife wouldn't have survived childbirth without Mrs. Quinn," said Jonas Webb, a quiet farmer from the North Fields. "She stayed through the night when others left. And my son's fever broke because she sat with him for hours," added Maribel Klein, tears already gathering. "I trust her more than any man who's ever carried a doctor's bag." Suddenly the tide turned. Murmurs became statements. Statements became support. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Even Walsh seemed hesitant to press further. But just as it seemed the matter would resolve peacefully, Vernon Pike himself stood up at the back of the room. "Let's not forget how this began," he called, his tone sharp. "This woman came to Riverbend hoping to marry for security. She failed in that, and now she plays house with our doctor under the guise of work." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mabel's hands tightened, but before she could reply, Silas stepped forward. "Enough," he said, his voice low but carrying weight. He turned to the council calmly. "There's a simple way to resolve any further concerns about appearances." He turned toward Mabel then, and in front of the whole town, before council and crowd alike, he spoke words that froze the room in place. "I intend to ask Mrs. Quinn to marry me." Mabel's breath caught, but Silas's eyes didn't waver. They were steady, sure, and impossibly tender in front of all those watching. "This has nothing to do with convenience or obligation. It has everything to do with respect, partnership, and yes, affection. I ask her here, before all of you, if she will be my wife." The hall went utterly silent. Mabel stared, stunned. The weight of gossip, judgment, and fear felt suddenly so small against the enormity of the question hanging in the air. She searched his face, saw no pity, no pressure, just belief, just quiet, genuine hope. And in that instant, she knew her answer. "Yes," she said softly but firmly enough for all to hear. "Yes, I will." The meeting erupted. Voices, laughter, applause from unexpected corners. Even the mayor rose and declared the matter settled. Olivia Harper stood and left without a word. Mabel stood still amidst the chaos, her cheeks burning, her heart racing. Not because of gossip anymore, because in front of the entire town, Silas Everett had made her something she hadn't dared to hope for again. Chosen. The morning sun broke gently over Riverbend, gilding the town in soft gold, as if even nature itself chose to mark the day differently. Mabel Quinn stood before the modest mirror in her borrowed room at Hattie's boarding house, smoothing the simple cream muslin dress over her hips. It was not grand. Nothing in her life had been since James died. But it was clean and new. Hattie had stayed up late stitching the lace trim herself, insisting a bride should feel special no matter how small the ceremony. Sarah and Jude, or her boys, cooed softly from their basket nearby, watching her with wide, curious eyes. They had no idea that by nightfall everything would be different again. But Mabel knew. This time the difference wasn't terrifying. She heard the knock just as she was pinning her hair. Hattie stepped in, eyes bright, cheeks flushed from bustling about. "They're already gathering at the church," she announced. "You'd think it was the governor coming through, the way folks are fussing." Mabel smiled softly but said nothing as she fastened the final pin. Hattie stepped closer, adjusting a stray lock gently, then resting both hands on Mabel's shoulders. "You've come far, dear, and this is not charity or pity or settling. I see the way he looks at you. This is earned. You remember that when you walk down that aisle." Mabel's throat tightened. She nodded, words failing her. Outside, the air was crisp but kind as they made their way down Main Street. The twins were in Hattie's care for the moment, dressed in matching pale blue knits and drawing as much attention as the bride herself. Mabel saw familiar faces as she approached the small white chapel. Ruth from the bakery. Jonas Webb and his wife holding their toddler. Even Mayor Wilson stood near the door, looking sheepish but sincere. And then, standing tall at the front steps in a black suit that seemed to carry the very weight of Riverbend itself, was Silas Everett. He wasn't smiling wide, wasn't beaming like a young man at his first love, but he was waiting, solid and certain, eyes steady as she climbed the few steps toward him. As they stood side by side before the pastor, Silas reached out and gently took her hand. The simple gesture settled Mabel's heart more than any grand speech could. The ceremony itself was brief, vows spoken plainly but with conviction. The promises weren't flowery or poetic. "I will stand beside you in this life, and in hardship, and in joy," Silas said, his thumb softly brushing the back of her hand as he spoke. Mabel returned his vow with one of her own. "I will walk with you, not behind you. I will share your burdens, and you will share mine." When they sealed the union with a kiss, soft, deliberate, and with no rush at all, it felt like a door closing softly behind them. No more questions, no more speculation, just them together. The reception was held outside the clinic in adjoining home, as much a community gathering as a wedding feast. The whole town had come, save for Olivia Harper, whose absence felt more like a relief than an insult. Tables were set with pies and roasted meats, baskets of fresh bread, and pitchers of cool well water and cider. Children darted between the adults, laughter mingling with the sound of fiddle music from Jonah Mills and his boy playing beneath the elm tree. Mabel felt hands on her shoulders, hugs offered freely now. Women who once looked down on her now leaned in to ask after the twins or thank her for her care. Men clapped Silas on the back, offering congratulations and quietly admitting the town was better for having her. Through it all, Silas remained close, always watching her as though still unable to believe she was real. Later, when the sun dipped low and only close friends remained, Mabel found herself sitting on the back steps of the house that was now her home. The twins were asleep upstairs, worn out from the excitement. Silas sat beside her, sleeves rolled, hands clasped loosely between his knees. "It's quieter now," Mabel said softly, staring out at the darkening sky. "It will be until morning," he replied. "Then life will resume. Fevers, births, sprains, and little feet racing down these halls." She smiled faintly. "It's strange. Months ago, I arrived here unwanted, nearly frozen, with no plan but survival. Now, I'm sitting here beside a husband, with a family, and somehow, I'm not just surviving. I'm living again." Silas turned slightly, his expression serious in the soft lamplight streaming from the kitchen window. "I meant what I said, you know," he murmured. "This wasn't about quieting the town. I would have faced every whisper, every accusation without this, if you'd asked me to." Mabel's heart tightened. "I know," she said simply, and reached for his hand. Their fingers wove together easily, naturally. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the last of the crickets chirping in the tall grasses beyond the fence. Finally, Mabel spoke again. "It's not the story I imagined for myself, but it's ours now." Silas squeezed her hand gently. "And I reckon it's only just beginning." As the stars blanketed the Dakota sky, Mabel Quinn Everett leaned against her husband, no longer a mail-order bride, no longer a woman defined by rejection or desperation. She was a wife, a healer, a mother. And most of all, she was home. When Riverbend turned cold, he stood by her. When the town doubted, she stayed anyway. And when the world called them improper, they built a life together on their own terms. But what do you think? Was it fate or courage that brought them together in the end? Tell us below. Would you risk everything for a second chance at love? And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we return with another tale that might just feel even closer to home.